Hey everyone, how's it going out there? Hope it's been a good trading day for all y'all. So we're looking at the S&P 500 on screen here. Been an interesting day. Had a pretty big run higher, then just a bit of a pullback recently, but we're still above this point of control. And we're just at the most active put strike in SPX translated to ES levels. So the pullback makes sense from what we're seeing in the structure of what's playing out in options flows. So we'll zoom back in just a little bit here into the microstructure of the S&P 500 futures contract. And then we're going to look around different parts of the market and just kind of get a recap. I was on earlier. We were talking about some of these options flows and some of what was driving the market earlier. So we'll take a look at all that as we get closer to the close here. Going to have NASDAQ on screen here as well, plugging around that point of control. Going back to the S&P, we can see there is still some reasonably large resting liquidity, both above and below, and building above around that most active call strike in SPX. The Russell has had kind of a topsy-turvy day, but mostly a day of distribution, now trading, pulling that point of control lower and trading below it. Now let's take a look at gold. Gold's still hovering around 2167, still pretty strong performance. We're going to zoom out a little bit. We can see a nice recovery in gold, not quite back to the intraday highs, but still coming off those lows with a bit of vigor. We've got crude oil here settling down. You know, the pit trading is closed in crude, but we saw it make a pretty good run earlier. It helped to bring up energy stocks, and then we're just settling a little bit lower after that run. We'll take a look here at the 10-year Treasury note. Now, this one was actually bleeding earlier, but it's come off of that quite a bit. So we had that bit of a sell down. Now we've come back. We see rates on the long end coming down. I'm sorry, this is the 2-year note contract. But again, we could see that there was that little bleed down, and now we're coming back up. Now we'll take a look at the 10. 10 getting a boost off of that point of control. When we did have selling in this one earlier, we saw a lot of absorption at these lower levels. We've got the euro here. Earlier, this one was really strong, showing us that weaker dollar, which is typically bullish for equities. Seeing a weaker dollar with 40% of S&P revenue coming from overseas, a weaker dollar tends to help those companies. And we have the yen, which was really strong earlier on commentary that the Bank of Japan might be moving from negative to 0% interest rate policy. Now let's look at some of the most popular stocks. We've got NVIDIA trading over that key option strike of 920. We talked about the flows at that strike earlier, and it practically became destiny. There was a lot of resting liquidity around that level. Price was trending in that direction. The next level of interest is 925, but we also, if we zoom out here quite a bit, we did see interest building at 950, both in the stock and also in the call flows. So 950, another level for those NVIDIA bulls out there to watch. We're going to move on to SMCI. SMCI moving up here to 1150. We did see some strong hedging flows in SMCI earlier. A couple, about $2.5 million or so, ensuring downside in SMCI. But we also have plenty of call buying. Let's take a look at the latest. Saw the 1170s for next Friday. That strike bid with about $134,000 of premium. So we're definitely seeing that push. The 1170s, I should say, for next Friday, yeah, about 134,000 in premium there. So again, you can kind of see that in the chain. You can see that interest building above in the stock as well. So what's happening in the stock market often impacts what we're seeing, you know, in options and vice versa. But options have really become the tail that wags the dog now. And we can see it with the magnetism of some of these key strikes and how price gets pulled towards that. Let's look at Meta here. Meta was a winner earlier. It had a nice break above a key level, and then it just gave it right back. So let's go in and kind of see what happened here. I'm going to go back a little lower. So earlier, we were really watching 510 as a key level in Meta. And when we broke above it, we saw this big release of energy. We got all the way up to like that resting liquidity just to 520, and then we're rejected really hard there. That's important. This is really bearish when you see it on Bookmap. When you see this touch into a large resting offer and rejection and lots of absorption, as we can see. And then we reflected lower and even broke temporarily below that 510. So I would say, you know, this is the kind of thing that knowing those resting liquidity levels and where options are flowing can really help. It's a lot less, you know, art, and it becomes much more scientific because we're able to see where there's large amounts of interest in a stock and in its options. Let's take a look at Amazon here. Amazon just chilling below that 177 resting offer, just above that 176.50. It has been consolidating after the drop we saw, and this is a lot like Meta. Amazon got to this huge resting offer around 178, reflected lower, right? So anytime you see this in Bookmap, it helps you get a sense of like, oh, wow, there's a lot of liquidity up there wanting to sell. If buyers run away, they're telling you we don't have the conviction to push price that much higher. We can't fill that offer. So naturally, that three-way auction is either going to consolidate or move lower. And often is the case, you get this kind of rejection like we saw in both Meta and Amazon. Now we've got Microsoft, Mr. Softy on screen. Big resting liquidity up there at 409.25. We can see a similar reaction here as well. We climbed up into that liquidity, we kind of consolidated under it, and then we were rejected. So again, you're seeing that pattern as to where these large levels of resting liquidity can be important. They can act as magnets, but if we can't break above them, we can get rejected, just like if we can't break below them, we can get reflected higher. This is why when I'm trading using Bookmap, I don't go for the exact level of resting liquidity. I'll take, you know, 50 cents, $1 lower, or whatever is appropriate in stocks, and similar with futures, I'll take a half point or a point lower. Why? Because I want to get the fill. I want to have more opportunities to trade. I'm not going to necessarily look for that big move above because it's less certain, particularly when there's really large levels of resting liquidity. Let's take a look at Apple. Apple is another one that's just had a pretty rough time. This is one of the former Mag 7 captains that's really just kind of let go. Let's zoom out here. So we can see there was some excitement this afternoon. We definitely had this, you know, this attempt to break out above 170, which has been kind of a key level in Apple. And now we're just starting to see us roll over. We had seen buyers pull up that point of control to 170, but now we're trading below it towards VWAP. And we do see there's a reasonable amount of resting liquidity down there at 168 and a large amount above us at 171. So that's kind of a range to look for as we get into the close here. But overall, Apple, you know, had some vigor earlier today, kind of giving some of that up. Google, this was another one that was really interesting. It is trading above its 200-day moving average, but it's also seeing a bunch of overhead resistance. So it chewed through a lot of these overhead levels earlier with a lot of conviction, but now it seems to be kind of losing steam. So similar look to Amazon and Meta, where you see these large levels of resting liquidity and the stock getting reflected lower. So that's sort of acting like a ceiling. Buyers just don't have the conviction to push through, at least yet. And then here's Tesla on screen, back up above that 177.77 level that we talked about being a key pivot. So it is looking more constructive overall. We do have a large amount of resting liquidity above there at 180, and we did ping it at one point, but we couldn't break above, right? So we got all those buyers absorbed there. You can see all that absorption, and now we got reflected lower. So again, that same look. This time they actually made the run for it, but there wasn't enough oomph to push all the way through. We've got XLE here back on the rise. We're going to zoom this one out since we're kind of recapping the day. So it did take a pretty good tumble here. Now we're starting to boost up higher. Again, I'm still bullish on energy over a swing time frame. I believe it still has room higher. And then we've got the semiconductors here. This ETF is 25% NVIDIA and 10% Taiwan Semi. So it's like 35% two companies, right? A third of it, more than a third of it, just two companies. So that's always interesting. But this is such an important area of the market to watch because this is where all the excitement is, especially today. All the unusual options activity that we've seen today, like if we go through all of it, about 85% of it were flows into semiconductor stocks and this ETF. So it tells you just how focused the market is on this stuff right now. So we're going to go all the way back around the loop. We've got 20 instruments loaded in Bookmap. So lots of cool stuff going on here. I've got a couple different data providers, just so it's clear. Like we're looking at futures through Rhythmic, we're looking at single stocks through DX Feed, and we're doing that all through just one instance of Bookmap running. And I've got it customized on S&P to also have my advanced SPX options visualizer on the right side. So that just shows the most active options in the SPX chain and where they translate to ES levels. Those options calculations are made every minute, so it updates throughout the trading day. Let's take a look around the headlines here, see what all is going on. We do have non-farm payrolls coming in tomorrow, 8:30 a.m. That is going to be pretty important economic data for the market to parse. The expectation going into tomorrow is 198,000. The prior reading was 353,000. Average hourly earnings, another important one to watch tomorrow. The prior reading was 0.6%. Tomorrow's expectation is just 0.2% of a gain month over month. And the unemployment rate forecasted at 3.7% with a prior reading of also 3.7%. Now, deviations that are strong away from this to the upside, like let's say non-farm payrolls come in at 300K or more, or let's say average hourly earnings come in at 0.4 or 0.5 or 0.6% or higher, or the unemployment rate comes in below 3.7, maybe 3.5 or lower, or some combination, that probably will boost rates and put some pressure on risk. On the other side, if you see these come in lower, that is to say, non-farm payrolls come in around 160, 150, average hourly earnings at 0.2% a month or lower, and unemployment rate at 3.8 or higher, then we could probably see a continued bid on the long end and in equities. So just something to take into consideration. That information is going to be quite important. We also have a Fed speaker pre-market at 7 a.m. Fed member Williams will be speaking, sharing their views ahead of the next Fed meeting. And we do see price on the S&P heading back to the most active call strike level in SPX. No coincidence there. These are why these levels are marked, because they tend to be areas of strong interest and they have a pretty good influence on price discovery in the futures as well. So we're looking at full chain. We're not just looking at 0 DTE. We're looking at all 10,000 strikes on the S&P 500 index options contract, right? And so in doing so, we're really getting a very good overview of what all is influencing price, because a lot of the hedging that happens from market makers from SPX options flow is reflected in ES futures, because it is a very liquid market to hedge into. So it's no surprise that the hot call, or the most active call contract, is having a pretty big impact on price discovery in the S&P 500 futures contract. Let's move over to the NASDAQ here. NASDAQ grinding higher into the close. We've got about 18 minutes left here. Got a large level of resting liquidity above, and we seem to be pushing right into that level. And there is a decent amount of buy-side delta. You can see that in those large green circles. That is buyers overwhelming sellers up until this most recent circle, where sellers are starting to come in and absorb a bit. Take a look at the Russell here. This one's been pretty choppy today, as you can see. It is starting to look a little more constructive as we approach the close. We're going to go back to the S&P here, then we'll look at some of the larger stocks. And we continue to see the E-mini S&P futures contract for March climbing towards that hot call level. That is the most active call strike in SPX, or the S&P index options. And it can act a bit like a magnet, especially when it is the most active contract on the options chain. And we did see a bigger build in consumer credit over the month of January. That was expected. So the expectation was 10 billion. The prior reading was 1.56 billion, but it was an actual build of 19.49 billion. So the consumer is back borrowing and spending again. And we do see interest payments on non-mortgage debt also surging. So revolving debt, there is a lot of borrowing going on. It will be interesting to see a better breakdown of where all that money is going. We'll see some of that in upcoming retail sales data as well. So we do see S&P continuing to build higher into the close. We've got just about 15 minutes left until the closing bell at 4 p.m. Let's take a look at the NASDAQ here. NASDAQ also looking quite constructive. And I'm just going to kind of zoom these in so they show a similar time frame just for consistency across these two pivotal charts. So they do have a very similar look about them, the S&P and the NASDAQ. And then we're going to go to some of these more liquid stocks that really have an important influence on the market. Here's NVIDIA. Up here, look at that, getting up to 925 and reflecting, right? We saw this a bit with some of the others. We can give it a chance to try to build back up there again. But, typically when you see that reflection, it's not the best sign. We do want to see buyers really step up and absorb that offer. Let's take a look at SMCI. SMCI, kind of a similar look as well. It did push through 1150, but seeing some resistance at 1155. Meta trying to make this climb here, pulling up the point of control, climbing right back above 510 and starting to make that push. It got rejected prior at 520. So that would be an area of resistance to watch as we approach the close and get into tomorrow. Amazon was rejected at that 178 and just sort of been falling and now consolidating since. We can see that how important that large resting liquidity above can be and how it impacts price discovery. Microsoft making a nice climb up to that resting offer up at 410 after bouncing and testing this point of control. We did have a decent amount of resting liquidity over there at 409.25. We talked about that earlier. Here we are right there and with room to 410 where there's also a decent amount of call interest. Apple just not having the best day overall. Company continues to struggle. And just giving back its gains here. I mean, what is there else to say? They pulled up the point of control finally and then just plunged below. Got Google here. Google is pushing above that 135 resting offer into the close. We'll see if we can get that break above or if that is a rejection, but it does keep trying. I will give them that. And then here's Tesla remaining above that key pivot of 177.77, trying to chew through 180 once again as we get closer to the close. Energy off of its lows here, and semiconductors continuing to build after a really rather incredible day. They had that draw, as we got into 3 p.m. and just building right back off of that. Go back here to the S&P 500. Seeing a little bit of a pull here. Let's move over to the NASDAQ contract here. Similar look as the S&P still, just sort of rolling over. And that last 10-minute period in the day can be pretty volatile. So for folks that are out there that are day trading, just take that into consideration for how you may be squaring up your books here as we approach the close. Seeing continued pull in the NASDAQ. Russell, similar look too. Just really not a very constructive look in the Russell at all today. Taking a look at gold. Gold's got a lot of resting liquidity up here at 2170. And it seems like from there, it kind of thins out a bit. And crude just kind of hovering here, now bouncing off the point of control closer to 79. We'll take a look at the 10s. 10s got a nice bid, kind of giving a little bit of that back. We saw a big iceberg sell, 5,000 contracts up here around 111, 220. Seeing a continuation of that pull in the S&P, let's take a look at the NASDAQ. Pretty similar theme, but S&P is showing more conviction there. There's certainly more sellers coming into the S&P contract. NASDAQ sort of following it. Market on close imbalance, 1.4 billion on the buy side. Not that these things really matter too much, but nevertheless, it is a data point that some look at. Just 10 minutes left in the trading day here. We see the S&P continuing to pull closer to this most active put strike and the point of control. We're going to zoom out just a little bit. We can see some degree of resting liquidity building below us here and thinning out above. We're going to move over to the NASDAQ here. Very similar look, just less conviction in the overall transacting. There's less volume in the NASDAQ overall, but we're still seeing that same kind of pull. And Russell, more consolidating than pulling overall. Let's zoom into the S&P contract here. We're heading much closer to that most active put strike, and we see resting liquidity building around that level. 138 long contracts stopped out in that last little pull. And let's zoom into some of these liquid stocks as we get into the close here. NVIDIA grinding back up to 925, giving it one more shot here, looking more promising this time around. SMCI grinding up into that 1155 resting offer as well with a little bit more vigor than the last attempt. Meta, not so much, really wasn't able to get back around to that 520 level, just seems to be settling back down. Amazon, similar look as Meta, sort of settling lower. Microsoft trying to give it another push here, actually looking kind of constructive into the close. I'm not quite sure it's going to get up to 410, but maybe it'll give it a shot here. Apple continuing to move lower, really giving back all of its gains. And Google continuing to consolidate just below that massive offer at 135. Tesla here trying, really just knocking that ceiling at 180, getting rejected. Looks like it's coiling up for another move here. We've only got about 7 minutes left, so we'll see how that goes. And we've got XLE just giving it a little bit of a pullback with the rest of the market. And semis actually grinding higher into some of the weakness we're seeing elsewhere. And we're back to the S&P 500, just seeing a bigger buy delta here. Some more buyers really coming in with some degree of conviction as we get into the last minutes of the close. Just about 6.5 minutes left. Money market assets hit a fresh record of 6.08 trillion in this week, really up to yesterday. So people still want to have their allocations in money markets. You know, maybe once the Fed actually starts cutting, we'll see those flows go elsewhere. But my sense is a lot of the folks in money markets are more fixed income investors looking for liquid ways to capture that. And then also corporate treasuries that are capturing some of those higher yields. I don't think it's so much people that are going to be flooding right into stocks. Of course, I could be completely wrong, but that's just my hunch. We do see the S&P getting a nice strong bid here. About 5.5 minutes left until the close. NASDAQ mirroring the S&P, but really, again, less conviction in this one. It's not leading, it's following. And Russell actually starting to show some signs of life here. We're going to start to look at some of those most actively traded stocks as well. First, we'll take a quick look at the euro, still building strength in the euro. So that's helpful for a lot of these large publicly traded companies with international revenues. That helps with their forex costs. Hey, look at that. NVIDIA grinding above 925, taking out that resting offer with some vigor into the close. That's quite bullish for the stock. SMCI taking out 1155 as well, kind of trading like it's paired at the hip with NVIDIA at times. So when one's running, the other tends to run. Nevertheless, a lot of absorption of sellers overhead. Meta still consolidating. Amazon, similar look. Microsoft finally making a good push through that 409 level, really taking out that offer that once again appeared there. Let's see if we can build into that strength into the close. Apple continuing to grind lower. Google continuing to consolidate above that large resting offer. Tesla continuing to consolidate after being rejected twice at 180. And XLE popping a bit into the close, as well as SMH, following in the footsteps of NVIDIA, SMCI, and other semiconductor stocks. Back to the S&P, which is climbing right up to this hot call level where there's a large resting offer. We just pinged that most active call. We took out some of that liquidity, but there's still a large resting offer overhead here. You know, these are the kind of levels that I like to target with my intraday trades if I'm going to take them, because it shows where there's a lot of interest. And beyond that, there's not as much, so I'm not necessarily going to be pushing too hard, right? Having reasonable goals, knowing where your exits are, that can really help with trading, whatever time interval we're trading on. Got about 2.5 minutes to the close. I bet you'd never guess that there's some big flows coming into NVIDIA into the close. 1,000 strike for next Friday, about 180,000 in premium paid for that. 1,000 strike in NVIDIA. And just tons and tons and tons of NVIDIA flows into the close here. Absolutely incredible. Woo! Bit of a pull there. Remember we talked about that last 10-minute volatility? There's a pretty good example of it playing out right before your eyes. But the flows into NVIDIA options today have been off the charts, and especially over the last hour, millions of dollars of premium, just laddering up into the 900s to the mid 900s, all the way up to the 1,000 strike. More coming in for next Friday, about 400 premium for the 950 strike, and NVIDIA just came over. Just all over the place with NVIDIA today. just extreme. I mean, this thing is already 1/5 of the premium paid in single stock options every day on across all the flows. It's largely on the call side, obviously, but the kind of flows we're seeing today even make that look a little bit tame in comparison. Nvidia is the single stock options market today, 100%. It's incredible to see. We do have Broadcom reporting after the close. I'll stick around for that. We'll see what happens from that major. In fact, you know what? Why don't we go ahead and bring it up somewhere here? Let's see where I can put it. I'll take XLE off for now. And we'll put AVGO. I just got to clean up the chart a little bit. So bear with me. All right, so we'll give that a moment to populate. I'll pull in some back data too, so we have that. And then we'll get right back to it. Just got less than a minute left to the close. And there's the close. Getting a bit of a continuation on that pull into the close here. So someone asked, is it good or bad if consumer credit came in better than forecast? And I would say that, it's a bit of both. It kind of depends on what all the money is going into. If people are using that money to pay for staples and rent and other kinds of traditional bills, then it's not great that they're borrowing. We do see consumer interest spend on revolving debt. That's things that are outside of mortgages and other kind of fixed rate debt. That's gone to record levels. So, that there's a contingent, the bottom two quartiles of consumers that are living a bit more paycheck to paycheck and beyond their means, and they're struggling. But if, on the other hand, people are taking out more loans to do things that are more discretionary because they're more confident about their financial future, having experiences doing travel and leisure, that's less bad, and it helps to stimulate the economy. So it really depends on where that money is going. It has to be contextualized. That's my 2 cents on it, at least. Let's go over to Broadcom here. There we go. And we'll be watching the headlines for this one. Communication services had quite a good day today, up 1.89%. Looking at that on Bloomberg right now. And then information technology up 1.89% today, leading the way higher. And the S&P 500 did close at a new record high today. We're just waiting for Broadcom earnings to come out here. Could be about 10 minutes or so from now, hearing on Bloomberg for Broadcom earnings. Oh my. Getting some reaction in the stock here already. They get a bit of volatility before these releases post, so could be some of that. We'll zoom out just a little bit so that we can deal with higher vol. And U.S. stocks did turn positive on the week after today's trading action. And a reminder, tomorrow again, we do get non-farm payrolls 8:30 a.m. along with unemployment and month-over-month average hourly earnings. That's going to be the big event volatility catalyst tomorrow. There's also a Fed speaker, Williams, at 7 a.m., but I don't think that's going to be quite the mover in the same way, particularly after Powell. We do expect Broadcom earnings in just about 5 minutes. All right, we're just going to take a look around the futures market as we await Broadcom earnings. We do see that S&P pull that started close to the close, really continuing after hours here. We're now just around where there was a lot of interest expressed in SPX puts, converted over to S&P 500 futures levels. NASDAQ, a similar look. You had a pretty big pull there. DocuSign earnings just came out. Fourth quarter EPS were 12 cents versus or 13 cents versus 12 expected. Revenue of 695.7 million versus an estimate of 685 million. Company bid up to 6102, up 13.9% after hours. Interesting. Marvell Tech down over 12% after hours here. It was really well bid in the calls today. Lots and lots of activity ahead of their earnings. Guidance looking a little soft for Marvell. That's causing that after hours sell down. Stocks down about 8.3% here. And there will be a distribution of outcomes across semiconductors. They're not going to all enjoy the same benefits. There isn't a sort of universal uplifting effect. It's really key segments that have most of the benefit, areas that have exposure to machine learning, that have exposure to automation, robotics, compute in general. They're benefiting more. And then the more traditional semiconductors, and even some of the sides on communications like Marvell, maybe not so much. Where that guidance certainly suggests there is some softness there. It's interesting to see that ahead of Broadcom. We'll see what we get from Broadcom in a few minutes here. Marvell's adjusted EPS came in at 46 cents, the same as expectations. The company stock trading down 10% to $76 after hours. And we're just watching Broadcom on screen here. The stocks, really no liquidity on the book at all. This is very typical ahead of earnings. And then you'll start to see it really come back into the heat map. We'll get a better idea of where market participants are placing their opinions on the distribution of price outcomes they're looking for after those earnings are being digested by high frequency algos and traders. Let's take a look at the news wires, see what else is happening here after hours. DocuSign sees total revenue for quarter one between 704 and 708 million versus an estimate of 700 million. Sees fiscal year 25 revenue at 2.91 billion to 2.92 billion versus a 2.9 billion estimate. So marginally better than what was prior expectations. There's some speculation going around as to whether Tesla bought more Bitcoin. A mysterious wallet increase sparks speculation. I'm reading on Benzinga. That would be interesting. I mean, with the Tesla stock doing what it's doing, kind of marrying itself back to crypto could probably be pretty good for it in the short term. Right into the close, there was another 445 million of premium, or 445,000, sorry, big order of magnitude difference there. 445,000 in premium paid for NVIDIA. Looking at those $950 calls for next Friday. So continued interest, really, all the way up into the very last minutes of the trading day and in higher prices of NVIDIA. Call skew in that is getting really, really skewed, like incredibly skewed to bullish extremes. So that's the only thing that I would say is that, it doesn't mean it can't go higher. It certainly can. It's just it needs more and more heavy lifting of flows to keep pushing and offsetting the decay of options. Just waiting for those Broadcom earnings to cross the wires here. Should be any moment. There was a lot of buying of Costco calls up into the close today, too, with their earnings coming out. So that is interesting. Some of those flows targeting the 800 strike in Costco for next week, next Friday. And we're just going to take a look around the futures here while we eagerly await Broadcom's earnings. NASDAQ seems to be stabilizing a bit here after hours. Had a little bit of a pop, settling down from that. S&P, even smaller of a pop there, really didn't register much on DocuSign. Now just coming back down here to around 51, 55, 50. Russell, kind of a basket case today, really all over the map. Had this pop before the close, then a nasty sell gapping down. Small caps having a bit of a distribution day overall. Even though they closed higher, they just kept getting sold into. Lots of absorption throughout the day. Rates continuing to move lower here, even after hours. We're going to zoom in a little bit on the 10-year note futures, but that's showing us as it moves higher, rates on the long end are moving lower. The dollar moving lower against the euro, the US dollar index about 70% weighted against euros. So when you see the euro moving higher, tells you the dollar is moving lower, and that's generally good for S&P and NASDAQ companies. The yen's stabilizing, but it did have a pretty big pullback after a big gain earlier. Overnight chatter from the Bank of Japan signaling that they may be closer to moving towards zero interest rate policy and away from negative interest rate policy. NVIDIA, just a bit now below that 925 level where we did see absorption of a lot of that resting supply overhead after hours. SMCI settling a bit down below 1155 and 1150 where it made that big push earlier. And Meta, just a little bit of stabilization after hours. Had a pretty nice run earlier, but gave a lot of that up. So let's go back here to Broadcom as we await earnings. We are seeing some price action here in Broadcom. Bit of a pullback. We're going to zoom out a little bit so we can see where resting bids and offers appear on the book. We can see there is interest building lower around 1350 and 1340. There is some interest above, but it's a little more tepid, just disappeared off the book there. And now we see a more of a pull happening in Broadcom. We do see Costco earnings coming over the wires. GAAP EPS, $3.92, beats the estimate of $3.81. Costco stock bid up 0.5% after hours here. Costco revenue missed their estimate. $58.44 billion versus an estimate of $59.19 billion on Costco. Broadcom coming in, beating earnings $10.99 versus an estimate of $10.29. Sales beat estimates $11.96 billion versus the estimate of $1.71 billion. So Broadcom a double beat. We do see a pretty big pull in Broadcom stock. Nevertheless, now trading down to $12.95 after hours here. The stock is down, looks like 8.51% after hours. And Costco down just about 1/3% now. Broadcom reversing just a little bit. These initial reactions can be a little bit intense. So let's see how it stabilizes. But again, Broadcom beat earnings of $10.99 versus an estimate of $10.29. Sales of $11.96 billion, beating an estimate of $11.71 billion for quarter one. And Costco recap, GAAP EPS again came in at $3.92 versus an estimate of $3.61. But revenue missed came in at 58.442 billion versus an estimate of 59.15 billion. Broadcom is stabilizing here, just down about 1.67%. What a wild little round trip that was. And Costco is stabilizing a bit too, now down just 0.2% after hours. Broadcom continuing to stabilize after hours. That initial reaction seemed like a misread, and there was nothing bad. I mean, they beat on revenue, they beat on earnings, they beat quite handily. Stock's now down just 1.46% after hours. Often is the case, the initial reaction is a bit of a head fake, and you could say perhaps this case was no different. Gap earnings coming out, shares higher about 7% after hours. We'll dive into that. EPS at 49 cents versus an estimate of just 23 cents. So beating handily, more than twice the estimate there on Gap Q4 earnings. Gap stock up about 9.83%. GPS, the symbol after hours here. All right, so let's take a look around the futures market, see if there's any kind of reaction to any of these earnings. Obviously not incredibly big earnings here, but still maybe enough to move the dial a little bit. S&P stabilizing after that move lower in Broadcom. Remember, Broadcom's a big enough company that it can move the S&P a bit. So 3,000 absorption here, though. Someone was interested in buying some ES exposure into that weakness before it slipped lower. NASDAQ also stabilized. There was a smaller iceberg there absorbing some of that selling pressure, not enough to stop it completely, perhaps slow it a bit. And Russell just sort of continuing to grind lower overall. So we'll get back to Broadcom here. Just stabilizing, really, down about 2% after hours, well off of its lows. It clocked lows of about 1285 or so. Seeing a little bit of a pull now in Avgo again, but not too much to write home about overall. You know, that initial dramatic drop into a very illiquid book, that's kind of what ends up happening. If there's any selling pressure, price is just going to keep going until there's a bid somewhere, and that's what it did. But to me, that was a bit of an overreaction, as the earnings weren't too bad. This is a stock that's priced for perfection, though. 42 PE, you know, so it is a bit rich. It's also a $652 billion market cap company. So when it moves, it does have some pull, and there is sympathy moves that can happen in other semiconductors as well. And Gap, looking at Q1 sales, saying looking at that being rather flat. So basically telling us some of that boost was holiday spend. They don't see much growth quarter over quarter. Nevertheless, market likes what they heard from Gap. The stock is up 8.25% after hours. We do see Broadcom pulling back a bit here, down now 4.41%. So for any kind of earnings reaction, if one's looking to buy or sell or otherwise transact, it's usually best to wait several days. And because tomorrow is Friday, I would say waiting till Tuesday probably makes sense if one's looking to really figure out what the market thinks about Broadcom earnings, because this stuff right now is being traded largely by algos on a somewhat illiquid tape. There's not a lot of liquidity in this order book. You can see how much more liquid this stock was before the market closed, right? There's a lot more on the order book there. And now there's really, it's basically a ghost town. So that's the other thing to kind of take into consideration when you're trying to trade earnings after hours. It can be kind of violent and the moves can be exaggerated because there's not as much participation, right? So let's see. Tomorrow, we don't have too much in terms of earnings. Earnings season's really starting to wind down a bit here. MongoDB down about 10% after hours. I'll take a look at their earnings here as well. This has been an interesting one. They're involved with gaming. They've leaned into AI because of the speed of their database. And MongoDB came in with earnings of 86 cents versus an estimate of 47 cents and sales of 458 million versus an estimate of 433 million. So ostensibly a double beat there, but market's not liking something. It's down 10.43% after hours to 370. See if there's anything interesting happening after market here. S&P futures just continuing to stabilize here. They did have a continuation of that pull. Was an interesting day overall, just pulling back the chart to show all the price action that we experienced today. It reminds me a little bit of yesterday, although the pull happened more towards the close and after hours. But yesterday we had a lot of excitement in the afternoon. Then we had this pullback. Today has kind of a similar look to it, albeit the pullback happening later in the day. And now after hours, we're trading where there was the second highest level of interest in SPX puts translated to ES levels. Well, let's take a quick look at the options chain on the S&P 500. I feel like 5150 has become even more important as we approach OPEX. And yeah, there is a decent amount of interest at that 51.50 level, particularly on the call side. So acting just a little bit magnetic, interest really significantly building at 5,200. If we look at net exposure, and on the Traderade Discord, we can do that by just typing in !SPX charts. Can find all the full chain gamma. We have the 0 DTE gamma. We even have gamma charts for every listed ETF, stock, pretty much everything that is traded on CBOE. So it's pretty cool. A lot of functionality I've built for that bot. Let's take a look at the NASDAQ here. We're going to zoom out so we can get a context for the whole trading day. And there was that same look, right? You had a lot of excitement and then this rather abrupt pull. And a lot of it happening after hours as well. So, you know, it's interesting just having these big ramps and then these kind of like letting go a lot of the air that's built up even more abruptly in the later part of the day. Russell had a kind of similar look, although its air started coming out of the tires a lot earlier in the small caps around, 1 p.m. You had the peak up till 2, and then we just started to see it selling down lower and lower. Dollar continuing to show weakness. This was really the story of the day in the Forex markets. Wasn't so much the yen, but the euro and that huge move off of Lagarde. This is why you got to be careful having big currency positions ahead of central bank chatter, because today we had Lagarde in the AM and, Powell shortly after 10 a.m. and really going on till after 12. And that all does have an impact on the dynamics in this market, because you could see from Lagarde's discussion, there was already room higher. There was a change in some of these dynamics where there was more supportive flows coming into the euro futures, and into her press conference. There was a lot of uncertainty about where euro policy, where ECB policy was going to go this year. And she tried to clear that up a little bit. I feel like she cleared up some of that dispersion by basically saying, we're going to be a little more hawkish than some of the people in the market think. So maybe lean more towards less cuts and a bit later. And so, with Ben Powell coming out and saying, hey, we're going to maybe lean into the shorter end of maturities on our balance sheet. Then we had another catalyst coming in with the 2 years, right? We saw that big pop. Then there was a little bit of steam let out, but then it actually started to seem like this right here, this big pop was more of an algo reaction. And then this was more like actual trading. So you got that continued build up into your note prices, which is people in the market saying, we're looking now for the Fed to maybe ease a little bit more, a little bit earlier. That also helped to put some weakness against the dollar, right? There's all these intermarket dynamics that do come into play here. And that was largely ostensibly supportive of stocks. When you have rates coming down, when you have the dollar coming down, that helps to give equities a bit of a bid. All right, so as we wrap up this stream, we'll take a quick look here at Broadcom, which is sort of stabilized after some turbulence, right? That's to be expected. I think it was a bit of an overreaction. I do think the stock is priced to perfection, but having it draw down 8-10% didn't really make a lot of sense. But at the same time, that's where the liquidity was. So even before we knew what the earnings were, we had a sense as to where the liquidity was on the order book. So we knew kind of where things could go to the downside, right? That's why that is helpful in the context of trading these things. Really, whenever we're trading them, we get a better sense as to where things may go. And the NASDAQ just really stabilizing here after that pull. So, folks, I'm going to hop off. Thank you so much for tuning in. The stream is brought to you by Traderade, where we help you find your trading edge. So check us out at traderade.com. You can get 20% off by using the coupon Mayhem20 at checkout on a monthly or quarterly plan. You can check out Bookmap. You can get up to 40% off that by visiting traderade.com/bookmap. And if you like the advanced SPX options visualizer, you can pick that up at the Bookmap marketplace now. It is available to the public, with more of those same tools coming soon. If you do become a Traderade member, you get a lot of discounts with a lot of other services that you can check out on our member deals page. And if you're interested more in longer term investing, check out macrovisor.com, where macro meets momentum, and that makes for opportunity. I will catch you all next time.